Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to Round 7 coverage of the Zurich 1953 Candidates Tournament. In Round 7, the players were looking a bit tired again, sort of like Round 3 where there were a number of short draws. But there were also several fighting and interesting games, and this is one of them. This is a game between Max Euwe and Svetozar Gligoric. So I've been working on my pronunciation of chess names. I have to say, well, first of all, there's a website or a YouTube channel called Chess Players Names Pronounced, something like that. I'll put a link to it in the description by Annie K. 1974, and where she just pronounces the names of chess players, so you can practice your own pronunciation. What's interesting is these names. They're three-syllable names like Taimanov and Botvinnik and Gligoric. A bit hard to pronounce correctly because not because the vowels are hard or anything, but because the emphasis is different. So I'd be tempted to say Gligoric or Gligoric, hitting the first syllable or the second syllable, but really it's there's an even stress on all the syllables, so it's Gligoric, just 1, 2, 3. no particular syllable emphasized over the others. And then Euwe, the Dutch player. I looked up Dutch pronunciations, and so the W is pronounced in a sound sort of halfway in between a W and a V, so sort of a soft V sound, and the EU is pronounced like the German O umlaut, so there's a bit more of a O sound in there that I'm really capturing, so it's something like Euwe, Euwe, yeah, more like that, Euwe. So anyway, that's what I've been working on in addition to the game. The other thing, well, I talked about Max briefly. He was the world champion previously and a famous Dutch player. I haven't mentioned Gligoric before, but he's a famous Yugoslavian, Serbian player. And he was never world champion, but he was a top player for many years, and he was famous for his contributions to opening theory, and in particular the King's Indian defense. He played that famous game against Najdorf at Mar del Plata, where he won with the King's Indian, and that tournament introduced the Mar del Plata variation. So that's one of the lines that he had worked on. So I thought it'd be interesting to see him play a King's Indian defense against the former world champion Euwe. So the game starts out d4, knight f6, c4, g6. So at this point, it could still be perhaps a Grünfeld or a Benoni, but it's the d6 move is going to be characteristic of the King's Indian defense. White at this point chooses not to play the main line, which the main line is, or the classical line is, bring the knight here, push the pawn to e4, develop the bishop to e2, and this knight comes to f3, that kind of configuration. Instead, Max plays the fianchetto variation against King's Indian, a very solid way to play, and where white doesn't quite come under such a fierce attack usually, but Gligoric is an attacking player. We'll see what happens in the game. So the bishops come out to their natural spots. Black castles, knight c3 is played, and d6. And now it's clear we've got a King's Indian setup, no more possibility of Grünfeld or Benoni. And white continues developing knight f3, and now knight bd7. In the classical line, the knight comes to c6 and then gets chased to e7. But you can see that's not possible here. So because the pawn's still on e7, you would have to play e5 first before developing the knight. So bringing the knight out here is just to support a later e5 or c5. And white castles. e5 is played now, and white plays e4. Now we have the typical King's Indian setup. And this line with the knight on d7 is also known from other variations of the King's Indian. The knight not only supports e5, but also can come to c5 in some lines, and we'll see that happening shortly. Black chooses right away to open up the center, exchanging, bringing a knight forward, but securing this square on c5 for his knight. So this exchange, it gets a piece, it gets a square for his knight, and it also opens up this diagonal for his bishop. So it's doing a couple of good things, although it leaves white with strong influence over the center with two pawns. and more space. So typical kind of trade-off in the King's Indian. And then one line, I was always interested in this move c5. If you can play knight to c5 before playing a4, what happens if, for example, white kicks the knight immediately? It turns out that the knight coming back to e6 is a decent square. And this sets up some tactics which are typical of the King's Indian, so I just wanted to show this. At this point, white really needs to defend the center with bishop to e3, or maybe even just move that knight away. But it's a bit loose there, and that can be taken advantage. That can be taken advantage of. So, for example, if white were to play rook e1, which is not a good move, black can play knight takes d4, queen takes, and now the queen is stuck, is sitting on the diagonal of the bishop. So black gets a free move with his knight, and he can go knight g4, opening up the bishop on the queen. The queen has to drop back and also has to stay in touch with the knight, which is loose here. Only the queen is defending it. And now there's this amazing move here, knight takes f2. So this is what I wanted to show you. The tactics are all there, and particularly in the King's Indian, a very tactical opening. It's the kind of thing you have to watch out for. The queen is overloaded, and the queen takes the knight. The bishop is just going to grab this knight and fork the two rooks. But if the king takes the knight, then black has the move queen f6, which is a check, and it also attacks the knight. So black gets the piece back and is a pawn up, and is just winning in this line. So you have to be very careful. So after a move like knight e6, bringing more pressure on the center, bishop e3 needs to be played. But since knight e6 is a good move, that means b4 is not the best move in this position. No sense chasing your opponent's pieces to squares where they want to go to anyway. So knight h3 is played by Max, a good move, controlling this g4 square and cutting down on some of these ideas. Rook e8 now. Black has a pretty simple plan. He's just kind of piling up on the e-pawn here. And now rook e1 coming over to defend it. And now a5. So I guess at this moment there was no way to bring more pressure on the e-pawn, and black sets about securing the position of his knight on c5 and maybe cramping white's queenside play a bit. So the queen went to c2, another defender for this pawn, and also opening up the d1 square here. Maybe a rook will come here. a4 is played, just restricting white's pieces over here on the queen side. If ever the pawn were to advance to b3, black could just exchange that off and open up the a file and perhaps create a weakness on b3. So, but white has got bigger things to worry about than the queen side. He's continuing to develop his pieces and building up a strong center. c6 is played. I guess this helps control some of these squares, so knight doesn't want black doesn't want a knight to be able to hop into the square d5 at an inopportune time, or even b5 perhaps. Rook a to d1, okay, taking advantage of the square that was vacated by the queen, and now knight f to d7, rerouting the knight and opening up this bishop. Okay, g4 was played here. And right here, this actually was a move that was a novelty. And maybe it's not the best move in the position. It seems like it's an okay move, but it hasn't been repeated since, or at least not in my database. So this move was a bit of a novelty. Previously, f4 had been played. Also, rook d2 is a move. f4 seems pretty logical. Okay, but g4. G4 makes sense. It's clamping down on this f5 push. Black often wants to push the pawn to f5 and open things up for a kingside attack. And this move knight, when the knight moves off of the f6 square, that's a signal that black is thinking about playing f5 there. And so this was white's reaction to it. So black continues developing with queen a5, getting his pieces into the game. It's interesting that the queen over here seems a bit out of play, but it can swing over to the other side very quickly, and we'll see that in a line coming up shortly. Bishop to f1. That's an interesting move. Just retreating the bishop, but defending the c pawn, and maybe the bishop is going to come out on this side. Knight to e6, so going to that good square we talked about earlier, putting more pressure on the center. King to g2. Okay, so that was the idea of the bishop to f1 move, is clearing a square for the king to come forward. It's often useful for the king to support this h-pawn, which is loose, although it doesn't seem to be a threat right away. But h5, black is attempting to open things up on the king side and maybe take advantage of this pawn push to g4. And now f3, just shoring things up. So these pawns are all on light squares, which may make this bishop a bit useless, but I think it'll be able to find a way into the game later. For one thing, black will have to exchange some of these pawns to open up lines for his own attack, and that will open things up for the light squared bishop. And that starts happening right away. H takes g4, opening up the h-file. And now knight to e5, bringing the knight forward, putting some pressure on f3, and also on the c-pawn, which is defended by this bishop on f1. So everything seems to be going according to plan here for both sides, and the engine rates this position about even. White here chooses to drop his knight back to e2, putting a little extra defense on the center with d4, and maybe with the idea of bringing the knight to g3, which was another point of this move g4. When g4 is played, the knight, it opens up the square on g3 for the knight. And a knight on g3 would be good. It would look out at this square f5 and help prevent any opening moves like pawn to f5. Okay, the exchange occurs. Knight takes d4 and takes back with the knight. So that was the other point, it's defending the knight so as to keep a knight on the d4 square. And now black pushes on with d5. And this is a very interesting move. Still the position is about even, so this is not it's not a foolhardy opening of the position, and it's also not immediately winning, but it's a pretty interesting way to play. It does open up a lot of lines, and after e takes d5, there's an interesting possibility for black that he didn't play, but Bronstein points this out afterwards. Oh no, actually, Bronstein points this out as the reason why he didn't play it. You might be tempted to sack on g4 here, because the bishop comes in, you get rid of two pawns, and you have a lot of lines pointing at white's camp. There's some interesting tactics here. So to look at what might happen, he could have tried knight takes g4. This variation doesn't work out. Knight takes g4. So let's show what the idea is first. So if you take and then take, hitting the rook, cancel that. Oh, take there first. That was the idea. Sorry, I was getting confused. So the knight takes the pawn takes knight, bishop takes knight over here, and bishop takes back. And now what's happened is this line has been opened up, attacking the rook, and it would be dangerous for white, except that he has one defensive move here. So see if you can, well, it's black's turn to move. So what's the defensive move after rook takes e1? That's your quiz for this video. Okay, I'm going to give the answer away. Rook takes e1. There's bishop to c3, hitting the queen and recapturing the rook. So if it weren't for that bishop to c3 move, black would just be a piece up at this point. No, the exchange up. It would be the exchange up, but also he's cleared out some pawns around white's king, and he'd be having a winning attack at this point. But bishop to c3 turns the tables, and white wins. So, so Bronstein was saying he thought that when d5 was played, that he was probably thinking of this tactic, and after e takes d5, he realized that this tactic wasn't working because of the move. It's a little bit hard to see. Let's erase some of these lines. I mean, there's a lot going on. You have to take here to clear out these pawns. and you have to take the knight in order to open up this line for the rook, and after that you've got two pieces hitting the rook on the corner on e1 here. But what you have to notice is the bishop, after the exchange, comes to the square d4 and then can go to c3 and defend. So that's what you have to be able to see to calculate that tactic correctly. Realizing that he couldn't play that, he took on d5. And so that was an interesting possibility there. It's still about even, since he didn't go down the faulty tactic. He's still attacking, and there's still chances for both sides. So after the pawn take, White played the move knight to b5, getting out of those discovered attacks on the knight, and maybe coming into c7 or d6 at an opportune time. D takes c4 was played, undermining the knight, and now the knight goes to d6, hitting the rook and hitting the bishop. And now this is another interesting point. At this point, Gligoric decides to continue the attack, or try to continue the attack, and not worry about losing the exchange here. So he plays the move bishop e6. Now it was possible to play rook e6 and get about an even game with maybe just a slight edge for White, but it's a very passive kind of position, and Black's pieces are all kind of stumbling over each other, so he didn't want to play that. What Bronstein pointed out was there is actually a tactic. There was a way for Gligoric to continue his attack here and get a significant advantage. So this would be another point to think about if you want to take a moment and see if you can find an attacking continuation for Black. And it's not, since I've already talked about rook e6 and bishop e6, it's not either of those moves. It's something else. Okay, I'm going to give the answer away. This is a deep one, but if you want to spend some time looking at it, it's kind of interesting. You can start with knight takes f3, and really the king has to take back. The knight is attacking things here. And then you continue with bishop takes g4. So you sacrifice two pieces just to get rid of that, just to get rid of those 2 pawns in front of the king, but also to pull the king forward. And now you have the move queen h5. So the queen swings over completely across the board in one move, and the king is in a very awkward position. If it goes to f4, then bishop to e5 check. This is actually, oh, not there, I'm sorry. Bishop to e5 check is mate in 5. So the queen supports the bishop, and they're covering all these squares. The knights, oh, where's the king go? Yeah, all these squares are covered, so the king only has one square to go to. e4, and bishop takes d6 check. Okay, getting a piece back, attacking the king. Anyway, yeah, you can see this isn't going to end well. So in this position, after queen h5 check, the king has to go to g3. That's the only other square. And now bishop e5 check anyway drives the king back to f2. And queen h4 check, you throw in one more check. King goes to g1 and then grab the knight. And so if we count the material, actually what Black has here is 3 pawns for a piece. So materially it's about even, but White's king is horribly exposed, and Black's attack is continuing. All his pieces have open lines, and so there's an advantage to Black, and that would be an interesting way to continue the game. So, well, Gligoric continued in an interesting way. He played bishop e6, giving up the exchange, which Max took. Took on e8, rook takes. And now this should be good for White with correct play. The chess engine is recommending bishop to f4 here. So White is just up the exchange, and well, I can't say he's just up the exchange. He's up the exchange for a pawn. And Black has the bishop pair. So from a strictly material point of view, the bishop pair is worth about half a point. The pawn is worth a point, and the exchange is worth about 1.5 points. So materially, actually, it's about even. But White with careful play can actually win the c pawn. This pawn is a bit loose out here. He can put pressure on the knight and grab this pawn. And so that's a strategy which would leave white with a significant advantage. Instead, white went for simplification with queen to c3. And so that's the path that was chosen, but now this is about even. So white gave up his winning chances there. And after knight to c6, bishop to b6, hitting the rook, now we get bishop takes c3. He loses a pawn. Now this was not an intentional loss of a pawn. He thought he was going to get his pawn back with the move rook e4. But there's a problem with this, which is the move bishop a5. And what's happening here is that after the exchange of the bishop on a5, the knight comes to a5 and defends this pawn. So we've got a bishop and a knight defending it, and a rook and a bishop attacking it. So white doesn't get his pawn back. So this line of play, starting with queen takes c3, is actually a bit, it's just not good for white. Leaves this pawn on c3 under immediate attack, and the idea that he had of defending it with bishop to b6 and rook to e4 was not working. Well, he wasn't talking about defending it, he was thinking about winning the pawn on c5. So bishop takes c3, rook e4 was played, and now Gligoric spots the opportunity, plays bishop a5, and after this exchange, the pawn is defended, and now black has two pawns for the for the exchange, and still has hopes of winning. If he can get these pawns connected, then he might be in good shape. So immediately, white's strategic aim in this point is to try and prevent those pawns from becoming connected. And so he starts playing very logically here. He plays rook e5, which is just preventing this pawn from coming forward. And he's going to cement this rook on the b file here and just prevent these pawns from ever getting connected. b6 was played to support the knight, which was under attack. So this move rook e5 came with tempo, and now the rook comes over to b5. So c3 was played here. Black gives up on the idea of being able to connect his pawns, but tries to get something going with just the passed pawn. And now rook c1 was played. And this gives some advantage to black. If white wants to try and hold on to things, he really needs to take immediately here and make sure he doesn't miss this opportunity to grab the pawn. So we're down to a situation where black just has one pawn advantage, and white still has the exchange. So if the play might continue here, rook to c8, bishop to a6, hitting the rook, rook to c7. He wants to just support this pawn and push it, but he doesn't want to give up a piece for it. And now rook to b5. Now hitting the knight, right, the loose knight there. The knight goes to c4, and now rook to c1. So with the knight in the way, there's pressure on the pawn. And the game continues, but it's about even here. So that would be a way for white to hold this game. But instead, white played rook c1 immediately, and now rook c8 was played. Good move, just threatening to push this pawn forward. Rook to b4, hitting the a pawn, giving up on the b pawn. Actually, in this situation, the a pawn is a bit more dangerous than the b pawn, so not a bad choice. But this pawn over here on a2 was hanging the whole time, which is why white needed to go after this pawn on a4. Was going to be a much more dangerous passed pawn. And now here, black makes the mistake. So bishop to d5 was played. And after this, the game is back around even. But there was a chance in this position. There was a dynamic possibility here for black, which is pretty interesting. So you want to look for a tactical move for black in this position, see if you can find one. The move knight to b3 is looking pretty interesting. So knight b3. This was analyzed by Bronstein, and he gave this continuation, which is good as far as it goes. So knight b3, hitting the rook. The rook goes to e1. Cancel that. Rook goes to e1. The pawn goes to c2, threatening to just become a queen, but leaving the bishop hanging. So rook takes bishop. Now the pawn goes to become a queen. And now rook takes, and rook takes. Rook a8 check. This white's rook gets active. King g7, and rook to b8, getting behind the pawn. And so this was the analysis that that Bronstein gave in the book, and it's correct as far as it goes. But then Bronstein says this is a draw at this point, and actually there's some interesting things still going on here. So it's true this pawn is under attack, but cancel that. Rook to c3, rather. Yeah, I was thinking knight d4, but rook c3 first. Starting to go after this pawn, and just ignoring the b pawn. White takes the pawn, and now knight to d4. So now there are two pieces attacking this pawn, and it's got to push forward. There's no way to defend it because the knight on d4 is guarding the square where the bishop might defend that pawn. So when the pawn comes forward, we have knight to c2, and now the king comes forward to get away from the check. There's a threat of cancel that. There was a threat of knight coming here check and winning the pawn or winning the bishop. One or the other. It's a fork of those two pieces, and the king can't defend both of them. So the king comes forward to avoid the check, and now the knight goes to e3. It's still hitting the pawn and the bishop, and it's both of them can't be defended. So rook to b4, defending one of the pawns anyway, and knight to g4 check. So that's how it might have gone down. Here, let's back up just a second. I had a thought. How about trying bishop to e2 here, then knight to d5, another fork, hitting the pawn and the rook. So, and then the rook can't move to a square that defends the pawn. So black is going to remain a pawn up in either of those lines. And just hard to say if it's enough for a win, but with a rook and a piece and a pawn up, it's something that you can play on for a win. So that's probably a good winning chance. It's certainly not a straightforward draw. Okay, so in this position, instead of going for knight to b3, which would have been pretty interesting, bishop to d5 was played. Cancel that. It's black's turn to move. Bishop to d5. Yeah, right there. Okay, putting some pressure on the f-pawn, but now black can defend this. So rook to b4. Staying in front of the b-pawn and keeping these pawns from becoming connected, so continuing with that strategic theme. The knight goes to b3, kicking the knight goes to b3. Okay, kicking this rook. Rook comes to c2. Knight goes to a1, hitting the rook again. There's a bit of a repetition here, but both players are still in a fighting mood. So after a few moves, they're just gaining time. Plays knight to b2. The bishop goes to e2 because it was hit by the knight there. Doesn't want to give up the bishop. And now bishop to b3. Supported by the knight attacking the rook. But there's a tactic here. Rook takes d2. Giving back the exchange. And if he takes the rook, then he can take the bishop. And this pawn is not promoting, and white is a piece up, so that's no good. But rook takes d2, black has the move c2, threatening to queen, and so black is forced to take that. But after rook takes c2, he offered a draw, and it was accepted because after this it's just completely even. And material is even. Let's see, white is going to have to defend his bishop, but there's no way that black can hold on to the pawn or hope to promote it. let's see, is that true? How about if the rook goes here and tries to defend the pawn? Oh, and the rook takes b3, right, the bishop is under attack. Okay, I was just checking. So he's going to lose the pawn here, and then it's going to be a dead even position. So the game ended in a draw, but a pretty exciting and hard-fought draw. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. In the tournament overall, all the games in round 7 were drawn except for one, and that was the game Smyslov-Geller. And that was not a very exciting game. Geller just played some kind of peculiar moves, and Smyslov went on to a pretty routine win. But because Smyslov drew and Smyslov won, and Reshevsky drew his game, they're tied up once again. So it's all even with Smyslov and Reshevsky tied at 5 points each. We have Paul Keres just one step behind at 4.5 points, and we have Miguel Najdorf at 4 points. So those are the leaders of the tournament after 7 rounds. Stay tuned. I'll be bringing you coverage for round 8. See you then. Bye.